I was 15 when my mother traded me for a Mercedes-Benz and a $3 million house in the hills. I know that sounds dramatic, but let me explain exactly what happened on that cold Tuesday morning in March, because it changed everything about who I thought I was and who I was destined to become. My name is Alex Morrison, and up until that day, I believed my mother loved me more than anything in the world. We lived in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in the worst part of downtown Detroit. The walls were paper-thin, the heating barely worked, and every night I fell asleep to the sound of sirens and shouting from the street below. But Sarah Morrison, my mum, always told me we were a team, just the two of us against the world. She worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. Mornings at the diner on 5th Street, afternoons cleaning offices downtown, and weekends stocking shelves at the grocery store. I watched her hands get rougher each month, watched the lines around her eyes deepen, watched her dreams shrink smaller and smaller until all she talked about was making it to the next paycheck. That Tuesday started like any other. I was getting ready for school when I heard voices in our tiny kitchen. Sarah was talking to someone, but her voice had this strange, nervous energy I'd never heard before. When I walked in, I found her sitting across from a man I'd seen on TV, Robert Sterling, the real estate mogul who owned half the city and had his face on billboards everywhere. He was exactly what you'd expect from a billionaire. Perfectly tailored grey suit, silver watch that probably cost more than our rent, and this way of sitting that claimed ownership of everything around him. But his eyes, they weren't cold like I expected. They were calculating, sure, but there was something else there. Something that made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't name. If you're enjoying this story so far, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because trust me, what happens next will completely change how you think about family, loyalty, and what it really means to be abandoned. Sarah looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before. Guilt mixed with desperation, mixed with something that looked almost like relief. Robert Sterling stood up, extended his hand toward me, and said words that are burned into my memory forever. "Alex, I'm going to marry your mother, and you're going to come live with us." I looked at Sarah, waiting for her to laugh, to tell him he was crazy, to protect me like she always had. Instead, she avoided my eyes and whispered, "Robert's going to take care of both of us now, honey. We'll never have to worry about money again." But I could read between the lines. I could see the truth in the way she gripped her coffee cup, in the way Robert looked at me like I was a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be welcomed. This wasn't about taking care of both of us. This was about her trading me for a life she thought she deserved. The next 3 hours were a blur of packing, paperwork, and watching my mother sign documents that essentially handed me over to a stranger. Robert's lawyers had everything prepared. Guardianship papers, enrollment forms for a private school I'd never heard of, even a detailed schedule of how my life would be structured from that day forward. As we drove away from the only home I'd ever known, I pressed my face against the window of Robert's Bentley and watched Sarah wave goodbye from our apartment balcony. She was crying, but she wasn't running after us. She wasn't changing her mind. She was letting me go. That's when I realized the truth that would fuel everything that came next. My mother had traded me for a better life, and I was completely on my own. Robert Sterling's house wasn't a house. It was a fortress. 23 bedrooms, 15 bathrooms, an indoor pool, a tennis court, and ground so vast you needed a golf cart to get from the main house to the gate. As we pulled up the circular driveway, I felt like I was entering a different world. Everything was pristine, untouchable, and utterly intimidating. The first person I met was Margaret, the head housekeeper. She was probably in her 60s, with steel grey hair pulled back in a perfect bun and eyes that seemed to see right through you. She looked at me like I was a stray dog Robert had brought home, something messy and unwanted that would need to be house-trained. "Master Alex," she said in a crisp British accent, "your room is prepared, mister. Sterling expects you in his study at 6 o'clock sharp for dinner discussion. Do not be late." My room was bigger than our entire apartment back in Detroit. King-size bed with Egyptian cotton sheets, a desk made from some kind of exotic wood, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city, and a walk-in closet already filled with clothes I'd never chosen. Everything was expensive, everything was perfect, and everything felt like a prison. I spent the first few hours exploring, trying to understand what my life had become. The house had a library with more books than I'd ever seen in one place, a gym that looked like something from a luxury hotel, and a kitchen where 3 different chefs prepared meals I couldn't pronounce. But despite all the luxury, despite all the space, I felt more trapped than I ever had in our cramped apartment. At exactly 6 o'clock, I knocked on Robert's study door. His voice called out, "Enter," and I stepped into what could only be described as a command center. Wall-to-wall bookshelves, multiple computer monitors displaying stock prices and news feeds, and a desk that looked like it could seat a board meeting. Robert was reading financial reports, barely glancing up when I entered. For 5 full minutes he let me stand there in silence. I started to understand that this was intentional, a power play designed to remind me exactly who was in control here. Finally he set down his papers and really looked at me for the first time since that morning. His gaze was sharp, analytical, like he was evaluating a potential investment rather than talking to a 15-year-old kid who'd just lost everything familiar in his life. "Sit down, Alex," he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his desk. "We need to establish some ground rules." I sat down, trying to look braver than I felt. Everything about this moment felt like a negotiation I was destined to lose. "First," Robert continued, "you will address me as Mr. Sterling. Not Dad, not Robert. Certainly not any of the colorful names I'm sure you're thinking right now. Mr. Sterling." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Second, you will attend Ashford Academy starting Monday. It's the best private school in the state, and you will not embarrass me there. Your grades will be exemplary, your behavior will be impeccable, and you will represent this family with dignity." Family. The word stung because we both knew that's not what this was. "Third, you will follow the household schedule without deviation. Breakfast at 7, school from 8 to 4, homework and study time until dinner, dinner at 7, and lights out by 10. Weekends will be structured similarly with additional activities designed to build character and discipline." He paused, studying my face for any reaction. I was determined not to give him the satisfaction of seeing how much this was affecting me. "And finally," Robert said, leaning back in his chair, "you will not contact your mother unless I give explicit permission. She has made her choice, and now you need to learn to live with the consequences of that choice." That's when something inside me snapped. The anger I'd been holding back all day finally erupted. "You can't keep me from talking to my mom," I said, standing up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. "I don't care how much money you have or how big this house is. You're not my father, and you can't control me." Robert didn't flinch. He didn't get angry. He just smiled, and somehow that was worse than if he'd started yelling. "Sit down, Alex." "No, sit down, or I'll have Margaret escort you to your room, and you'll spend the next week learning about consequences the hard way." I wanted to keep fighting. Every fiber of my being wanted to storm out of that office and find a way back to my real life. But something in Robert's voice told me he wasn't bluffing. This man was used to getting exactly what he wanted, and resistance would only make things harder for me. Reluctantly, I sat back down. "Good," Robert said. "Now listen carefully, because I'm only going to explain this once. Your mother didn't trade you for money, Alex. She traded you for security. For both of you. She could have kept struggling, kept working 3 jobs, kept watching you grow up in poverty with no real opportunities. Instead, she made the hardest decision a parent can make. She gave you a chance at a better life, even though it meant sacrificing her relationship with you." I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, but something in his tone made me listen. "You can spend the next 3 years hating her, hating me, and hating this situation. You can rebel, act out, and make everyone's life miserable, including your own. Or you can decide to make the most of an opportunity that 99% of kids your age will never get." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city lights that stretched to the horizon. "The choice is yours, Alex, but understand this. I didn't ask for a son, and I certainly didn't ask for an angry, resentful teenager who thinks the world owes him something. If you want to be part of this family, you'll earn it. If you want my respect, you'll earn it. And if you want to make something of yourself, you'll stop feeling sorry for yourself and start working toward becoming the man you have the potential to be." He turned back to face me, and for the first time I saw something in his eyes that wasn't calculation or control. It might have been understanding, or maybe it was just wishful thinking on my part. "Dinner is in 30 minutes. Margaret will show you to the dining room." I stood to leave, my head spinning with everything he'd said. Just as I reached the door, Robert called my name. "Alex!" I turned around. "Welcome home!" Those 2 words hit me harder than anything else he'd said, because despite everything, despite the anger and confusion and fear, some small part of me desperately wanted them to be true. The next morning, I woke up in Egyptian cotton sheets, feeling like I was living someone else's life. The alarm clock beside my bed read 6:30 a.m., which meant I had 30 minutes to get ready for breakfast, according to Robert's schedule. Part of me wanted to stay in bed just to prove I couldn't be controlled, but something about the way he'd looked at me last night made me think that defiance would only hurt me in the long run. Ashford Academy was everything I expected and worse. Perfectly manicured campus, kids who drove cars worth more than my mum made in 2 years, and teachers who spoke like they were addressing future world leaders rather than teenagers. I was the outsider in every possible way. My clothes were expensive now thanks to Robert's intervention, but I wore them like a costume. Everyone could tell I didn't belong. During lunch, I sat alone at a table near the window, watching groups of students who'd known each other since kindergarten share inside jokes and plan weekend trips to their families' vacation homes. That's when I met Jason Whitmore, a senior whose father apparently owned a chain of luxury hotels. Jason had the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about anything: perfect teeth, perfect hair, and the assumption that the world would always bend to accommodate his desires. He approached my table with 2 of his friends flanking him like bodyguards. "You're the Sterling kid, right?" he said, not bothering to sit down. "The charity case Robert picked up?" I looked up from my sandwich, already feeling my temper rising. "Something like that. Interesting," Jason continued, clearly enjoying having an audience. "My dad knows Robert, says he's got a soft spot for strays. First it was that wildlife conservation thing. Now apparently he's moved on to collecting disadvantaged youth." His friends laughed like he'd said something incredibly clever. I set down my sandwich and stood up, which put me at eye level with Jason despite being 3 years younger. "Maybe your dad should worry less about Robert Sterling's business and more about teaching his son some basic manners." The cafeteria had gotten noticeably quieter. Students at nearby tables were turning to watch what was clearly about to become entertainment. Jason's smile didn't waver, but something cold flashed in his eyes. "Careful, charity case. You might have fooled Robert into thinking you're worth something, but everyone here knows exactly what you are. Poor white trash with a price tag." I hit him. Not a calculated punch, not a strategic move. Just pure, unfiltered rage that connected with his perfectly straight nose and sent him stumbling backward into his friends. Blood immediately started flowing, and Jason's expression shifted from smug superiority to shocked disbelief. "You broke my nose!" he screamed, hands cupped over his face. "You actually broke my nose!" 3 teachers appeared within seconds, followed quickly by security. I was escorted to the principal's office, while Jason was taken to the nurse, and within an hour I found myself sitting across from Dr. Harrison Blackwell, Ashford Academy's headmaster. Dr. Blackwell was probably in his 60s, with the kind of dignified bearing that comes from decades of dealing with privileged teenagers and their equally privileged parents. He looked at me over his reading glasses with an expression that suggested disappointment rather than anger. "Mr. Morrison," he said, consulting a file that was remarkably thick for someone who'd been enrolled for exactly 6 hours. "This is quite an impressive debut. Physical assault on your first day. I believe that might be a school record." I sat in silence, partly because I didn't know what to say and partly because I was still processing what had just happened. The anger was starting to fade, replaced by a growing awareness that I'd probably just destroyed whatever chance I had at making this work. "Mr. Whitmore's parents are demanding your immediate expulsion," Dr. Blackwell continued. "They're also threatening legal action and have suggested that perhaps Ashford Academy isn't the appropriate environment for students of your background." He let that hang in the air for a moment, studying my reaction. "However," he continued, "I've just gotten off the phone with Mr. Sterling. He's asked me to suspend you for 3 days while he handles the situation personally. He also mentioned that you'll be spending those 3 days learning about consequences in a more direct fashion." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in the back of Robert's Bentley, staring out the window and trying to figure out how to explain what had happened. Robert hadn't said a word since picking me up, but I could feel his disappointment radiating from the front seat like heat from a furnace. We didn't go back to the house. Instead, Robert drove to what looked like a construction site downtown. As we got closer, I realized it was more than just construction. This was the site of a massive commercial development, with cranes and workers and machinery that represented millions of dollars in investment. Robert parked and got out of the car, gesturing for me to follow. We walked through the controlled chaos of the construction site until we reached a small trailer that served as the on-site office. Inside, a foreman named Miguel was reviewing blueprints with 2 other workers. "Miguel," Robert said, "I'd like you to meet Alex. He's going to be working with your crew for the next 3 days. Miguel looked at me, then at Robert, clearly confused about why a billionaire was bringing a teenager to a construction site. "Sir, I'm not sure this is the best place for—" Alex needs to learn about real work, Robert interrupted. About what it means to earn something through sweat and effort, rather than through threats and violence. Can you teach him that? Miguel nodded slowly, understanding passing between the two men. Robert turned to me, his expression serious, but not unkind. You'll be here at 6 a.m. sharp for the next 3 days. You'll work a full 8-hour shift doing whatever Miguel tells you to do. At the end of each day, you'll write a report about what you learned, and on Friday we'll discuss whether you've earned the right to return to Ashford Academy. He paused, studying my face. This is your first real lesson, Alex. Not about construction or manual labor, but about understanding that every action has consequences. You can't punch your way through problems, especially not problems that stem from your own insecurity and anger. If you want to be successful in this world, you need to learn to control yourself and channel that energy into something productive. As Robert drove away, leaving me standing in work boots and a hard hat that were both too big for me, I realized this wasn't just punishment. This was the beginning of something I didn't understand yet, something that would either break me or force me to become someone completely different from the angry, confused kid who'd thrown that punch 6 hours earlier. Miguel handed me a shovel and pointed toward a pile of concrete debris that needed to be cleared. "Welcome to the real world, kid," he said with a grin that was surprisingly kind. "Let's see what you're made of." 3 days of construction work changed everything I thought I knew about myself. By the end of the first day, my hands were raw and bleeding. By the end of the second day, every muscle in my body screamed in protest. But by the end of the third day, something fundamental had shifted inside me. Miguel turned out to be more than just a foreman. He was a philosopher with calloused hands and a PhD in life experience. While we cleared debris, mixed concrete, and hauled materials under the scorching sun, he told me stories about his journey, from undocumented immigrant to successful contractor, about the difference between working hard and working smart, and about the kind of character that gets built one difficult decision at a time. "You know what your problem is, Alex," he said on that third afternoon, as we sat on a stack of lumber, sharing lunch and watching the city skyline shimmer in the heat. "I think everything that's happened to you is about you." I was exhausted, sunburned, and my pride was somewhere in the pile of rubble we'd been clearing all week. "What do you mean? Your mom marrying that rich guy, getting sent to that fancy school, even punching that kid in the nose. You think it's all about Alex Morrison and what the world is doing to him." Miguel took a bite of his sandwich and studied me with those wise, weathered eyes. "But life isn't about what happens to you, kid. It's about what you decide to do with what happens to you." When Robert picked me up that Friday evening, I was a different person than the angry teenager he'd dropped off Monday morning. I still had questions. I still had hurt. But I also had something I'd never experienced before, the bone-deep satisfaction that comes from earning something through honest work. Robert didn't say anything during the drive home, but I caught him glancing at me in the rearview mirror. When we pulled into the circular driveway, he finally spoke. "How do you feel?" "Tired," I said, "but good tired." "Good." He turned to face me. "Tomorrow you return to Ashford Academy. Jason Whitmore's parents have agreed not to press charges in exchange for a formal apology and a donation to the school's scholarship fund. You'll apologize not because you're sorry for defending yourself, but because you're sorry for handling the situation poorly." I nodded. The distinction made sense. "But Alex, understand this. I won't bail you out again. Not from school problems, not from legal troubles, not from any mess you create for yourself. If you want to be part of this family, if you want the opportunities that come with being a Sterling, you need to prove you can handle them responsibly." That night, as I lay in my Egyptian cotton sheet staring at the ceiling, I realized Robert Sterling wasn't just talking about being part of his family. He was talking about becoming the kind of man who earned respect rather than demanding it. The next 6 months at Ashford Academy were a masterclass in controlled aggression. I channeled every ounce of anger and frustration into my studies, into athletics, into proving that the kid from Detroit could not only survive in their world but excel in it. My grades went from barely passing to Dean's List. I joined the debate team and discovered I had a talent for verbal combat that was far more effective than physical violence. Most importantly, I started paying attention to Robert Sterling in a way I never had before. Every evening after dinner, Robert would retreat to his study to review the day's business. Initially, I'd assumed this was just him counting money or whatever rich people did behind closed doors. But as I began to understand more about his world, I realized those evening sessions were strategic planning meetings with himself. He was constantly analyzing market trends, evaluating potential investments, and calculating risks that most people couldn't even comprehend. One evening in late October, I knocked on his study door. "Enter. Mr. Sterling, could I ask you something?" He looked up from a stack of financial reports, and I was surprised to see what might have been approval in his expression. "What's on your mind? How did you know? About the construction site, I mean. How did you know that's exactly what I needed?" Robert set down his papers and really looked at me, because 25 years ago, I was an angry kid who thought the world owed me something. My father died when I was 16, left us with nothing but debt and a failing hardware store. I spent months feeling sorry for myself, making excuses, blaming everyone else for my problems. This was the first time Robert had ever shared anything personal about his past. What changed? My mother made me work in that hardware store every day after school and all weekend, not because we needed the money, although we did, but because she knew I needed to understand what it meant to earn something, to build something, to take responsibility for my own success, instead of waiting for someone else to hand it to me. He stood up and walked to the window, just like he had that first night. I turned that hardware store into a construction company, then a development firm, then a real estate empire. But it all started with learning to swing a hammer and understanding that success isn't about what you're given, Alex. It's about what you do with what you're given. For the first time since arriving at his house, I felt like Robert Sterling was talking to me as a person rather than as a problem to be solved. "Would you like to learn how this business really works?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Good. Tomorrow after school, we start your real education." What Robert Sterling called my real education turned out to be the most intensive crash course in business, psychology, and human nature that any 16-year-old had ever received. Every day after school, instead of going to my room to do homework, I reported to Robert's study for what he called practical application seminars. The first lesson was about observation. Robert would show me photographs of properties he was considering for development, and I had to identify everything I could see: the neighborhood, the demographics, the potential for growth, the challenges that weren't immediately obvious. At first, I saw just buildings and empty lots, but gradually I began to see patterns, opportunities, and risks that weren't visible on the surface. "Real estate isn't about buildings, Alex," Robert explained as we reviewed my analysis of a downtown warehouse district. "It's about understanding people, where they want to live, where they want to work, where they want to spend their money. The buildings are just tools for giving people what they don't even know they want yet." The second lesson was about numbers, but not the kind they taught in math class. Robert showed me how to read financial statements, how to calculate return on investment, how to understand cash flow and leverage, and a dozen other concepts that turned money from something you spent into something you controlled. But the most important lesson was about patience and timing. Robert never made quick decisions. He would spend weeks analyzing a single opportunity, looking at it from every possible angle, considering scenarios that seemed impossibly unlikely. I watched him walk away from deals that looked perfect on paper, because some instinct told him the timing wasn't right. "Most people think business is about being aggressive," he said one evening, as we reviewed a potential acquisition that he'd ultimately decided against. "But real success comes from being patient enough to wait for the right opportunity and smart enough to recognize it when it arrives." By Christmas break, I was spending more time in Robert's study than in my bedroom. I was reading industry publications, analyzing market reports, and even sitting in on some of his phone conferences with investors and city planners. I began to understand that Robert Sterling hadn't just gotten lucky with real estate. He had systematically built an empire by understanding things that other people missed. More importantly, I began to understand what he was trying to teach me. This wasn't just about business. This was about developing the kind of mind that could see opportunities where others saw problems, that could remain calm under pressure, that could make difficult decisions based on logic rather than emotion. If you've ever wondered what it takes to build real wealth, not just make money but create lasting success, stick with me, because what I'm about to share will change how you think about opportunity, risk, and what it really means to think like an entrepreneur. The breakthrough moment came in February. Robert had been analyzing a struggling shopping center on the south side of the city for months. The current owners were behind on their mortgage. Several major tenants had left, and everyone assumed it was a dying property in a dying area of town. But I had been studying demographic reports and city planning documents as part of my education, and I noticed something Robert hadn't mentioned. The city was planning to build a new metro line with a stop just 2 blocks from the shopping center. The plans were public record. but buried in hundreds of pages of municipal documents that most people never bothered to read. "Mr. Sterling," I said one evening, interrupting his review of the shopping center financials, "did you know about the metro expansion?" He looked up, and I could see the exact moment when my question registered as something more than idle curiosity. "Show me." I spread out the planning documents I'd printed from the city's website, highlighting the proposed metro route and the timeline for construction. Robert studied the papers in silence for several minutes, and I watched his expression shift from mild interest to focused intensity. "When did you find this?" "Last week. I've been checking city planning documents for all the properties we've reviewed. I thought maybe there would be patterns or opportunities that weren't obvious from the real estate reports." Robert leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely impressed. "Alex, do you understand what you've just discovered?" "I think so. If the metro station brings commuters to that area, the shopping center could become valuable again, maybe more valuable than it's ever been." "Exactly. And if we can acquire it before the metro construction begins, before the current owners realize what's coming, we could turn a failing property into a gold mine." Robert smiled, and it was the first time I'd seen him look truly pleased about anything I'd done. "Congratulations, Alex. You've just identified your first real estate opportunity. Now let's figure out how to capitalize on it." Acquiring the struggling shopping center turned out to be more complicated than either Robert or I had anticipated. The current owners, a development company called Hartman Properties, were desperate to sell, but also suspicious of any interested buyers. They'd been burned by previous negotiations that fell through, and they wanted to make sure anyone making an offer had both the financial resources and the genuine intention to close the deal. Robert decided this was the perfect opportunity for me to understand how complex negotiations actually work. Instead of simply making an offer through his lawyers and accountants, he involved me in every step of the process. "Business isn't just about having the right information, Alex," he explained, as we prepared for our first meeting with Hartman Properties. "It's about understanding the people you're dealing with, their motivations, their fears, their pressure points. David Hartman isn't just trying to sell a property, he's trying to save his company and probably his reputation." David Hartman turned out to be exactly what Robert had predicted, a man under enormous pressure who was smart enough to recognize an opportunity, but desperate enough to make mistakes. He was probably in his 50s with the kind of nervous energy that comes from juggling too many problems at once. When we met him at the shopping center on a cold Tuesday morning in March, he looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Mr. Sterling," he said, shaking Robert's hand with the enthusiasm of someone who was trying very hard to appear confident. "I have to say, I was surprised to get your call. This property isn't exactly in your usual market segment." Robert smiled politely. "I like to diversify my portfolio, and sometimes the best opportunities are in markets that other investors are avoiding." We spent 2 hours walking through the shopping center, with Hartman pointing out the potential of the space, while trying to downplay the obvious problems: empty storefronts, dated infrastructure, and a parking lot that needed serious repair. But I could see what Robert saw: good bones in a location that was about to become much more valuable. The interesting part was watching Robert negotiate. He didn't try to hide his interest in the property, but he also didn't reveal how much he knew about the upcoming metro expansion. Instead, he focused on understanding Hartman's situation and finding ways to structure a deal that would work for both parties. "The challenge with this property," Robert said as we sat in Hartman's temporary office in one of the empty storefronts, "is that it needs significant investment to reach its potential. New tenants, infrastructure improvements, probably a complete renovation of the common areas." Hartman nodded eagerly. "Exactly. That's why we think it's perfect for someone with your resources and vision. The right buyer could really transform this place." "What's your timeline?" Robert asked. "How quickly do you need to close?" I saw Hartman's jaw tighten slightly. This was the pressure point Robert had been looking for. "We're flexible on timing," Hartman said, but his voice suggested otherwise. Robert leaned back in his chair, projecting the kind of calm confidence that I was starting to recognize as one of his most effective negotiation tools. "David, can I be frank with you?" "Of course. This property has been on the market for 8 months. You've had several interested buyers, but no closed deals. That tells me either your asking price is unrealistic, or there are problems with the property that aren't immediately obvious, or you need to close much faster than you're admitting." Hartman's face went through several expressions before settling on resigned honesty. "We need to close within 60 days, he admitted. We have loan obligations that we can't extend, and this property is the only asset we have that can generate the capital we need. Now we're getting somewhere, Robert said. What's your absolute bottom line? The negotiation that followed was like watching a masterclass in psychology. Robert never threatened, never pressured, never made Hartman feel cornered. Instead, he helped him see how a quick sale at a lower price was actually better than holding out for a higher price that might never come. In the end, we agreed on a purchase price that was 30% below Hartman's original asking price, with a 60-day closing timeline and contingencies that protected Robert's interests without making Hartman feel like he was taking all the risk. As we drove away from the shopping center that afternoon, I was buzzing with excitement. That was incredible, I said. How did you know exactly what to say? Experience, Robert replied, and understanding that the best negotiations are the ones where both parties feel like they've won something. Hartman got the quick sale he needed, and we got the property at a price that makes sense given our plans for it. When do we tell him about the metro expansion? Robert glanced at me in the rearview mirror. We don't. That information was publicly available to anyone who cared to look for it. Hartman's team should have done their due diligence. The fact that they didn't isn't our responsibility. I thought about that as we drove back to the house. There was something that felt almost unfair about profiting from information that Hartman could have found if he'd looked for it. But I was beginning to understand that business wasn't about fairness. It was about preparation, research, and being smart enough to see opportunities that other people missed. Is that ethical? I asked. Robert was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. Alex, I didn't hide anything from David Hartman. I didn't lie about our intentions or misrepresent the property's value. I offered him a fair price based on the current market conditions and the risks involved in developing that property. The fact that I have better information than he does is the result of better preparation, not deception. He pulled into our driveway and turned to face me. But your question is important, and it's something you'll need to answer for yourself as you get more involved in this business. There's a difference between being smart and being ruthless, between taking advantage of opportunities and taking advantage of people. The challenge is learning to recognize that difference and deciding what kind of businessman you want to be. That night, I lay awake, thinking about Robert's words and about what I'd learned from watching him negotiate. I was beginning to understand that success in business wasn't just about having money or connections. It was about developing a way of thinking that allowed you to see opportunities that other people missed, to understand psychology and motivation, and to make complex decisions under pressure. But more than that, I was beginning to understand what Robert had been trying to teach me from the beginning. He wasn't just showing me how to make money. He was showing me how to think like someone who deserved success. 6 months later, the metro construction began, and our shopping center investment proved to be even more profitable than we'd projected. Property values in the surrounding area increased by 40% in the first year, and we had a waiting list of potential tenants for spaces that had been empty for years. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the moment I realized I had stopped thinking like Alex Morrison, the angry kid from Detroit, and started thinking like someone who belonged in Robert Sterling's world. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was built through hundreds of small lessons, daily conversations about business strategy, and gradual exposure to a way of thinking that was completely foreign to everything I'd learned growing up. Robert never lectured me about success or handed me a book about business principles. Instead, he showed me how successful people actually think by letting me observe and participate in real decisions that involved real money and real consequences. By my senior year at Ashford Academy, I wasn't just surviving in that environment, I was thriving. My grades were in the top 5% of my class. I was captain of the debate team, and I had been accepted to several prestigious universities with full academic scholarships. But more importantly, I had developed something that most of my classmates would never have, a deep understanding of how money, business, and opportunity actually work. Jason Whitmore, whose nose had healed crooked and who still flinched slightly whenever I entered a room, had become a strange sort of measuring stick for my progress, not because I cared about intimidating him, but because his reaction to me demonstrated how much I had changed. I no longer carried myself like someone who expected to be rejected or attacked. I carried myself like someone who belonged wherever he chose to be. The real test came in the spring of my senior year, when Robert presented me with what he called my final exam. "I've been watching you for 3 years," he said one evening as we reviewed the quarterly reports from our shopping center and 2 other properties we'd acquired using similar strategies. "You've learned to think strategically, to analyze risk, to understand market dynamics, and to control your emotions under pressure. But there's one skill you haven't had the opportunity to develop yet." "What's that?" "Leadership. Specifically, the ability to identify and develop talent in other people." He handed me a business plan that was unlike anything I'd seen before. It was a proposal for a property management company that would specialize in acquiring undervalued commercial properties and transforming them into profitable investments. "This would be your company, Alex. You would be the CEO responsible for every decision from hiring staff to choosing which properties to target. I would provide the initial capital and serve as an advisor, but the success or failure of the company would depend entirely on your ability to build and lead a team." I stared at the business plan, trying to process what Robert was offering me. This wasn't just an opportunity to make money. This was a chance to prove that everything I'd learned over the past 3 years had actually transformed me into someone capable of creating success rather than just participating in it. "Why now?" I asked. "Because you're 18 years old, and it's time for you to start building your own empire rather than just learning about mine. But more than that, because I think you're ready for the responsibility." He leaned back in his chair and studied me with the same analytical expression I'd seen hundreds of times over the past 3 years. "Alex, when you first arrived here, you were angry and entitled and convinced that the world owed you something. You thought success was about proving you were better than other people or getting revenge against people who had wronged you. Do you remember that?" I nodded, feeling slightly embarrassed about the person I'd been. "But now you understand that real success is about creating value for other people while building something that lasts. You've learned to control your emotions, to think strategically, and to see opportunities that other people miss. Most importantly, you've learned that your success doesn't depend on anyone else's failure." Robert stood up and extended his hand toward me. "So what do you say? Are you ready to become an entrepreneur?" I shook his hand, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt like we were meeting as equals rather than as teacher and student. "Yes, sir, I'm ready." Over the next 6 months, while most of my classmates were enjoying their final year of high school, I was building a business from scratch. Robert had been right about the challenge of leadership. Analyzing properties and understanding market trends was relatively straightforward compared to hiring people, managing personalities, and creating a company culture that would attract talented employees and loyal clients. My first hire was Maria Gonzalez, a recent graduate from the University of Michigan, with a degree in finance and a work ethic that reminded me of my construction days with Miguel. My second hire was Thomas Chen, an architect who had been laid off from a major firm and was looking for an opportunity to prove himself in a smaller, more entrepreneurial environment. By the time I graduated from Ashford Academy, we had acquired our first property, a small office building in a transitional neighborhood that was showing signs of economic revival. By the end of that summer, we had renovated the building, filled it with small businesses and creative professionals, and generated a return on investment that exceeded even Robert's projections. But the real success wasn't financial. It was the moment I realized I had become the kind of person who could see potential where other people saw problems, who could inspire others to work toward a shared vision, and who could create opportunities for people who reminded me of the angry teenager I used to be. Standing in the lobby of our first renovated building, watching Maria explain our leasing process to a potential tenant, while Thomas reviewed blueprints for our next project, I understood what Robert Sterling had been trying to teach me all along. He hadn't just given me money or opportunity, he had given me something far more valuable, the ability to create my own success and to help other people create theirs. 3 years earlier, I had believed my mother traded me away for money. Now I understood she had traded me for something much more important, the chance to become someone who didn't need to be traded for anything because I had learned to create my own value. 5 years passed before I saw my mother again. 5 years of building my company, expanding our property portfolio, and becoming the kind of person I never imagined I could be. By the time I turned 23, Morrison Property Development had acquired and renovated 17 buildings across 3 states. We employed 42 people and managed over 2 million square feet of commercial space. The angry teenager from Detroit was now a millionaire entrepreneur, but the scars from that 15-year-old boy were still there, hidden beneath expensive suits and business success. Robert and I had evolved into something that resembled a real father-son relationship, though we both pretended it was still just business. He had remarried 2 years earlier to Catherine Wells, a brilliant corporate attorney who treated me like family from the moment they introduced us. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I belonged somewhere, like I had people who genuinely cared about my success and happiness. That's why the phone call from Detroit General Hospital hit me like a physical blow. "Is this Alex Morrison?" the voice asked. "Yes, who's calling?" "This is Dr. Patricia Williams at Detroit General. We have a patient here, Sarah Morrison, who listed you as her emergency contact. She's asked us to call you." The world seemed to stop moving. Sarah Morrison, my mother, the woman who had traded me away for a better life 5 years ago and had never tried to contact me since. "What happened?" I managed to ask. "Ms. Morrison is in the final stages of pancreatic cancer. She was admitted last week, and her condition has deteriorated rapidly. She's been asking for you constantly. Sir, if you're going to visit, you should probably come soon." I hung up the phone and sat in my office for 20 minutes, staring at the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows that cost more than most people's annual salary. My mother was dying, and she wanted to see me. The same woman who had signed papers handing me over to a stranger without looking back was now asking for me in her final moments. Robert found me there an hour later, still sitting in the same position. "Alex, Margaret said you missed your lunch meeting with the Phoenix investors. That's not like you." I told him about the phone call, about Sarah, about the cancer. Robert listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from concern to something that looked like understanding. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to pretend this call never happened. Part of me wants to drive to Detroit right now. And part of me wants to call that hospital back and tell them that Sarah Morrison doesn't have a son." Robert walked to the window and stood beside my chair, both of us looking out at the city we'd helped shape through our investments and developments. "Can I tell you something about forgiveness, Alex?" "What about it?" "It's not about the person who hurt you. It's about the person you want to become. Your mother made a choice 5 years ago that broke your heart and changed your life. But you have a choice to make now that will define who you are for the rest of your life." He turned to face me, and I saw the same expression he'd worn that first night when he'd welcomed me home. "You can go to Detroit and face your past, or you can stay here and let that 15-year-old boy's anger control your decisions for the rest of your life. Either choice is valid, Alex, but only one of them is worthy of the man you've become." 6 hours later, I was on a plane to Detroit. Detroit General Hospital looked exactly like the kind of place where people went to die. Fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sick, the smell of disinfectant mixed with despair, and the constant background noise of machines keeping people alive who might not want to be. I stood outside room 314 for 10 minutes, trying to work up the courage to knock. When I finally opened the door, I almost didn't recognize the woman lying in the hospital bed. Sarah Morrison had always been small, but now she looked fragile in a way that suggested she was holding on to life through sheer willpower. Her hair was gone, her skin was the color of old paper, and her eyes seemed too large for her face. But when she saw me, those eyes lit up with a joy that hit me harder than any anger could have. "Alex," she whispered, and her voice was exactly the same as I remembered. "You came." I sat down in the plastic chair beside her bed, not trusting myself to speak. "You look—" She paused, studying my face, my expensive suit, the confidence I'd learned to wear like armor. "You look like a man." "Hello, Sarah." She flinched at my use of her first name, but nodded like she understood that calling her mum was a privilege she'd forfeited years ago. "I know you probably hate me," she said. "I know what I did was unforgivable, but I need you to understand why I made that choice." "I understand perfectly," I said, and my voice was colder than I'd intended. "You traded me for financial security. You chose a comfortable life over your own son." Tears started flowing down her cheeks, but she didn't try to defend herself. "You're right. That's exactly what I did. But Alex, I need you to know that it was the hardest decision I've ever made, and not a day has passed that I haven't regretted it." "Then why didn't you try to contact me? Why didn't you call or write or visit? Why did you just disappear?" Sarah closed her eyes, and for a moment I thought she'd fallen asleep. When she opened them again, there was something in her expression that looked like shame. "Because Robert Sterling made me promise to stay away. He said that if I truly wanted what was best for you, I would let you build a new life without the constant reminder of where you came from. He said that having me in your life would only hold you back." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "Robert told you to stay away? He was right, Alex. Look at what you've become. Look at what you've accomplished. Would any of that have been possible if I'd been calling you every week, crying about how much I missed you, making you feel guilty for the choice I made?" I stared at my mother, processing what she'd just told me. Robert Sterling, the man who had become more of a father to me than my own father ever was, had been keeping my mother away from me for 5 years. The man I trusted more than anyone in the world had made decisions about my life without consulting me. But as I thought about it, I realized he'd been right. If Sarah had been part of my life during those crucial years, I would have been torn between two worlds, unable to fully commit to the transformation that Robert was guiding me through. I would have remained Alex Morrison from Detroit instead of becoming the person I was now. "Do you resent him for that?" I asked. Sarah smiled, and for a moment I could see the woman who had raised me in that cramped apartment, who had worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. "No, sweetheart, I'm grateful to him. He gave you something I never could have given you. He gave you a future." We talked for 3 hours that first day. About her illness, about my business, about the person I'd become and the life I'd built. Sarah never asked for forgiveness, never tried to justify her choice, never made excuses. She simply wanted to know who her son had become. Over the next week, I visited her every day. I told her about my company, about Robert and Catherine, about the deals I'd made and the properties I'd developed. I told her about Miguel and the construction site, about the shopping center investment, about Maria and Thomas and the team I'd built. What I didn't tell her was how confused I felt about everything I'd believed for the past 5 years. Sarah Morrison died on a Tuesday morning at 6:47 a.m., exactly 9 days after I'd received that phone call from Detroit General Hospital. I was holding her hand when it happened, watching the monitors flatline while the morning sun streamed through the window of room 314. Her last words were, "I'm proud of you, Alex," and they hit me with the force of everything I'd been trying not to feel for the past week. The funeral was small, just me, a few nurses from the hospital who had grown fond of her during her stay, and Mrs. Patterson from our old apartment building who somehow heard about Sarah's death and wanted to pay her respects. As I stood beside the grave in a cemetery that overlooked the Detroit River, I realized I was mourning not just my mother's death, but also the relationship we never got to have. The flight back to Chicago gave me 6 hours to think about everything Sarah had told me, about Robert's role in keeping us apart, and about the choice I now had to make. I could confront Robert about his deception, demand an explanation for why he'd made decisions about my life without consulting me. Or I could accept that he'd done what he thought was best for me, even if it meant making himself the villain in my mother's story. By the time I walked into Robert's study that evening, I'd made my decision. "How did it go?" he asked, looking up from a contract he'd been reviewing. "She died this morning." Robert set down his papers and really looked at me. "I'm sorry for your loss, Alex. I know that was difficult. She told me about your conversation with her, about how you asked her to stay away." Robert's expression didn't change, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "What else did she tell you? That she agreed with your decision? That she thought it was best for me? Do you?" I sat down in the chair across from his desk, the same chair where I'd sat as an angry 15-year-old who thought the world owed him something. "I understand why you did it. I even think you were probably right. But Robert, you made a decision about my life without giving me the choice. You decided that I was better off not knowing my mother wanted to see me." "Yes, I did." Robert leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely uncertain. "Alex, I've made a lot of difficult decisions in my life, but that was one of the hardest. Your mother called me 6 months after you arrived here. She was crying, saying she'd made a mistake, asking if she could see you." He stood up and walked to the window, continuing to speak without looking at me. "I told her that if she truly loved you, she would give you the space to become who you were meant to be. I told her that the best gift she could give you was the freedom to build a new life without the constant reminder of the old one." "And you never told me about that call." "No, I didn't. Because I knew that if you'd known she wanted to see you, you would have spent the next 5 years torn between two worlds. You would have felt guilty about your success, conflicted about your loyalty to me, unable to fully commit to the opportunities I was trying to give you." Robert turned back to face me, and I could see something in his eyes that looked like vulnerability. "Alex, I made that decision because I believed it was what was best for you. But you're right that I should have given you the choice. I treated you like a child who couldn't handle complex emotions, when you deserved to be treated like someone who could make his own decisions about his relationship with his mother." I sat in silence for several minutes, processing everything he'd said. Part of me was angry that he'd kept this from me. Part of me was grateful that he'd protected me from a choice that might have derailed my progress. But mostly, I was trying to figure out how to feel about a man who had become my father by making decisions that weren't his to make. "Are you going to forgive me?" Robert asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I understand why you did it, and I even think you were probably right. But Robert, you've spent 5 years teaching me about trust, about integrity, about making decisions based on complete information, and then you kept crucial information from me about my own life. You're right. And I'm sorry." It was the first time I'd ever heard Robert Sterling apologize to anyone for anything. "But Alex, I need you to understand something. I didn't keep your mother away from you because I was trying to control your life. I kept her away because I love you like a son, and I wanted you to have every possible advantage in building the life you deserved." "Love me like a son?" I repeated. Robert nodded. "From the moment you punched Jason Whitmore in the nose, I knew you had the kind of fire that could either destroy you or forge you into something extraordinary. Everything I've done since then has been about helping you become the man I saw that you could be." I looked at Robert Sterling, this man who had taken in an angry teenager and turned him into a successful entrepreneur, who had given me opportunities I never could have imagined, who had become more of a father to me than my biological father ever was, and I realized that forgiveness wasn't about whether he deserved it. It was about whether I wanted to carry the weight of resentment for the rest of my life. "Robert," I said finally, "you made a decision that wasn't yours to make. But you made it for the right reasons, and you've spent 5 years proving that you had my best interests at heart. Does that mean you forgive me?" "It means I understand you, and maybe understanding is more important than forgiveness." Robert smiled, and it was the first time I'd seen him look genuinely relieved about anything. "There's something else you should know," he said. "Your mother's medical bills. I've been paying them for the past 6 months." "What?" "She called me when she got the diagnosis, not to ask for money, just to let me know that she was sick and that she might want to see you before she died. I told her I'd handle the medical expenses, and that when the time was right, I'd make sure you knew." I stared at him, trying to process this latest revelation. "You were going to tell me?" "Eventually, when I thought you were ready to make that choice without it destroying everything you'd built." "And when would that have been?" "I don't know, maybe never, maybe tomorrow, maybe when you got married or had children of your own. The timing would have depended on who you became and what you needed." I laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "So you were making decisions about my life based on your assessment of who I was and what I could handle?" "Yes, and I was wrong to do that. But you did it because you love me." "Yes." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights that stretched to the horizon. Everything I could see from that window, every building and street and neighborhood, represented opportunities that I never would have had if Robert Sterling hadn't taken me in. Every dollar in my bank account, every employee in my company, every relationship I'd built in this world existed because Robert had made the decision to transform me from an angry kid into someone who could create value. But it also existed because my mother had made the hardest decision of her life, trading her relationship with me for the chance that I might become someone extraordinary. "Robert," I said without turning around, "I forgive you. Not because what you did was right, but because I understand why you did it, and because the alternative would be spending the rest of my life angry at the person who taught me how to build a life worth living." When I turned back to face him, Robert Sterling was crying. It was the first time I'd ever seen him show that kind of emotion, and it made me realize that he'd been carrying the weight of his decision for 5 years, wondering if I would hate him when I eventually learned the truth. "Thank you," he said. "But Robert, if we're going to continue being family, you need to promise me something. Anything. No more decisions about my life without my input. No more protecting me from choices that you think I can't handle. I'm not that angry 15-year-old anymore. I'm a man who can handle complex emotions and difficult decisions. I promise." We shook hands, and for the first time since I'd learned about his conversation with my mother, I felt like we were equals again. 2 years have passed since Sarah Morrison died in that hospital room in Detroit, and I think about her choice almost every day. Not with anger anymore, but with a kind of understanding that only comes from building something meaningful yourself and realizing what you might be willing to sacrifice to protect it. Morrison Property Development now manages over 4 million square feet of commercial space across 7 states. We employ 137 people, and last year we generated more revenue than some Fortune 500 companies. But the success that matters most to me isn't measured in dollars or square footage. It's measured in the opportunities we've created for people who remind me of the angry teenager I used to be. Maria Gonzalez, who started as my first hire fresh out of college, now runs our entire East Coast division. Thomas Chen has become one of the most sought-after commercial architects in the country, with a waiting list of clients who want him to transform their failing properties into thriving communities. And we've hired dozens of young people from backgrounds similar to mine, giving them the same kind of opportunity that Robert Sterling gave me 8 years ago. But the real transformation happened inside me, in the way I think about family, loyalty, and the choices we make when love requires sacrifice. Robert and I have developed the kind of relationship that I never thought was possible. He's still my business mentor, still the person I turn to when I need advice about complex deals or difficult decisions. But he's also become something more important. He's the father I chose and who chose me, not because of biology or obligation, but because we recognized something valuable in each other and decided to build a family based on mutual respect and shared values. Catherine has become more than just Robert's wife. She's the mother figure I never expected to find, someone who celebrates my successes and supports me through challenges without trying to replace the complicated relationship I had with Sarah. When she and Robert told me last month that they're expecting their first child together, I realized that I'm going to be someone's big brother, and that this baby will grow up in a family that was created by choice rather than chance. I've also learned something about forgiveness that I couldn't have understood when I was 15 years old. Forgiveness isn't about pretending that someone didn't hurt you or that their choices were justified. It's about deciding that your future is more important than your past, and that carrying resentment only gives other people's mistakes the power to control your life. I forgave my mother not because trading me away was the right thing to do, but because I understood that she made an impossible choice with limited options and did what she thought would give me the best possible future. I forgave Robert not because lying to me was acceptable, but because he made his decisions out of love and had the courage to admit when he was wrong. Most importantly, I learned to forgive myself for being angry, for feeling abandoned, for spending years believing that I wasn't worth fighting for. The truth is that both Sarah Morrison and Robert Sterling fought for me in the only ways they knew how. Sarah fought for me by giving me up, and Robert fought for me by refusing to give up on me. Today I'm sitting in my office at Morrison Property Development, reviewing plans for our next acquisition, a struggling community center in Detroit that we're going to transform into a hub for entrepreneur education and business development. It's the same neighborhood where I grew up, the same area where my mother worked 3 jobs trying to make ends meet. In 6 months, that building will house classrooms where kids from backgrounds like mine can learn about business, finance, and real estate development. The phone on my desk rings, interrupting my thoughts. It's Maria, calling from our Boston office. "Alex, I just got off the phone with the Peterson Group. They want to discuss a partnership for that mixed-use development in Cambridge." "What kind of partnership?" "The kind that could double our East Coast portfolio in the next 2 years. I smile, feeling the familiar rush of excitement that comes with a new opportunity. "Set up the meeting." "And Maria?" "Yeah." "Include Thomas in the conversation. This sounds like the kind of project where his architectural vision could really make the difference." "Already on it." "Alex, I have to say, this company you've built, the culture you've created here, it's something special. You should be proud of what you've accomplished." After I hang up the phone, I think about Maria's words and about the journey that brought me to this moment. 8 years ago, I was an angry 15-year-old who felt like the world had abandoned me. Today, I'm someone who creates opportunities for other people, who builds communities, and who understands that the greatest success comes from helping others discover what they're capable of achieving. The truth about what Robert Sterling did to me, what my mother did to me, and what I eventually did with all of it, is that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to force them to discover their own strength. Sometimes being traded away is actually being set free. Sometimes losing the family you were born into means finding the family you were meant to create. If you've made it this far in my story, if you've followed me from that cramped apartment in Detroit to this office overlooking a city I've helped shape, then you understand something that most people never learn, that your circumstances don't define you. Your choices do. That success isn't about what happens to you, it's about what you decide to do with what happens to you. I hope my story inspires you to look at your own life and ask yourself, what would you do if someone handed you an opportunity to become more than you ever thought possible? What would you sacrifice for the chance to transform not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. And most importantly, what kind of legacy do you want to build with the time you've been given? My mother traded me for a rich man, never imagining what he would do to me. What she couldn't have known is that he would teach me to become the kind of man who creates his own wealth, who builds his own family, and who never needs to be traded for anything because he's learned to create his own value. That 15-year-old boy from Detroit thought he was being abandoned, but now I understand he was actually being launched into a life beyond anything he could have imagined. Sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is the opportunity to discover who you really are when everything familiar is taken away. And that, more than any amount of money or success, is the true transformation that Robert Sterling gave me. The knowledge that I am not defined by where I came from, but by who I choose to become.